The secret lives of Rome's boy concubines, slaves of pleasure in the emperor's court. They don't tell you this in school, but Rome, that shining empire of law and marble, ran on the screams no one was allowed to hear. Beneath the Senate's polished speeches and the poet's golden verse, lay rooms that reeked of perfume, sweat, and silence. Rooms where boys too young to know shame were turned into shadows of themselves, living currency in the emperor's private economy of pleasure. No historian wants to touch this. No textbook mentions the delicati, the soft ones. But the records are there, buried in legal documents, letters, graffiti on villa walls. You just have to know where to look. Because this is not history. This is a warning. You see, there was a system in place, refined over centuries, perfected by emperors, senators, and generals who believed they were gods on earth. And in this system, beauty wasn't an accident. It was a resource to be harvested, shaped, and consumed. The younger, the better. The softer, the more valuable. The more obedient, the more profitable. They were taken from the fringes of empire, Gaul, Syria, Britannia, cultures Rome called barbaric, but plundered like treasure vaults. Not for gold. Not for wheat. But for children. A boy with golden hair might fetch 5 times the price of an ox. If he cried too much, he'd be punished until he stopped. If he fought, he'd be broken. And if he complied? He might live longer, but not better. He would be renamed. Reclothed. Reborn as something Roman. Ganymede. Narcissus. Apollo. They weren't names. They were functions, symbols of submission disguised as myth. And the most prized of them? They weren't sold into whorehouses. They were groomed for villas. For palaces. For men who wore crowns and laurel wreaths. The emperors. The gods among men. The ones whose statues still stand in museums, while their crimes rot in silence. But today, you'll hear them. You'll hear the boys they silenced. The ones who learned to speak with their eyes, to cry without sound, to survive by becoming beautiful objects. Because this isn't about Rome. It's about systems that still exist. That still hide. That still hunt for obedience masked as love. You ready for the truth? Good. Because once you hear it, you can't ever go back. You were never meant to hear this. The senators knew it. The scribes knew it. Even the boys knew it. Because silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. In the heart of the empire, there was no sanctuary. Only stages. And every villa, every banquet hall, every imperial chamber, was a theater of domination. Behind closed doors, beneath chandeliers of blown glass and bronze, Rome didn't play politics. It played God. They called them pure delicatus, the delicate boys. Hand-picked. Sculpted by hunger. Refined by terror. And sold like instruments of pleasure to those with enough denarii and dead conscience. But make no mistake, this was not passion. It was control dressed in silk. The emperors didn't love these boys. They owned them. Like furniture. Like status symbols. Take Emperor Nero. A man whose lust was only matched by his hunger for power. He didn't just buy a boy named Sporus. He married him. Forced him into a wedding gown. Called him Empress. Had his body mutilated to mirror a woman's form. All because Nero wanted to recreate the wife he murdered, Poppaea Sabina. He killed her in a rage. Then replaced her with a child. This was not perversion. It was Rome's highest form of narcissism. An emperor so intoxicated by his own desires, he reshaped another human soul into a reflection of his grief. Of his guilt. Of his power. And the people cheered. They laughed at the ceremony. Sang songs about Nero's bride. Because when corruption wears a crown, the crowd claps instead of screams. You see now? This wasn't an exception. It was a pattern. Codified. Institutionalized. Hidden beneath layers of myth and marble. The same empire that gave you aqueducts, roads, and philosophy, also gave you ritualized child servitude in golden chains. And it kept records. Names. Ages. Roles. Because every empire, no matter how enlightened it pretends to be, has a ledger of souls it was willing to spend for pleasure. They were boys who became symbols. Then shadows. Then nothing at all. And the question isn't just what happened to them. It's what system survived. Changed costume. Changed name. But never stopped. There is a reason these truths were buried, because if you understood how Rome worked behind its marble mask, you'd start to see echoes of it in the world around you. And that would make you dangerous. Understand this, the concubines weren't just victims. They were tools. Strategically deployed, psychologically engineered. Their bodies were currency in political games far darker than anything the Senate dared record. And the training? It wasn't about sex. It was about obedience. From the moment a boy was selected, he entered a system designed not just to break him, but to recode him. Language was the first incision. They stripped his native tongue, replaced it with Latin and Greek, not as education, but erasure. Because a man who cannot speak his mother's words, cannot remember who he was. Then came etiquette. The boy learned to walk like a whisper, to pour wine with sacred stillness, to hold eye contact just long enough to appear alive, but never long enough to challenge. He was taught which gods to mention. Which poets to quote. How to laugh at a master's joke before it finished. And how to cry silently, beautifully, like a statue cracking from within. And always, always, the grooming. The oils. The herbs. The careful starvation of masculinity. Because the ideal was not manhood. It was boyhood, frozen in time. An eternal youth, stripped of identity, preserved in aesthetic perfection. But here's what no scholar will say out loud, these boys weren't just passive ornaments. They were weapons. Placed at the feet of emperors. Carried into banquets. Displayed at political gatherings. Because possessing a delicatus wasn't just private indulgence. It was status warfare. To own beauty was to dominate nature. To display obedience was to flex unseen power. To parade a perfect, submissive boy in front of rivals? That was a message. Not of lust. But of total control. Because the empire wasn't built on conquest alone. It was built on the illusion of divinity. And what better way to prove you're a god, than to remake another human being in your image, and have him thank you for it? So ask yourself now, what kind of system needs that kind of proof? What kind of world builds thrones on the backs of broken children? And what kind of man starts asking these questions? If you've made it this far, you already know the answer. The deeper you go, the more you realize, this wasn't just deviance. It was doctrine. There were rules, rituals, and a code of conduct among the elite for how to handle their delicati. And once a boy entered that system, there was no exit. Only evolution, or extinction. The villa walls saw everything. And the boys who lasted the longest weren't the strongest. They were the most adaptive. The ones who could mirror their master's moods like water reflects the moon. Some became favorites. Whispered into the ears of senators at feasts. Used to extract secrets, manipulate deals, distract ambassadors. Because beauty disarms. Softness cloaks intent. And while the old men spoke of taxes and war, the boys listened, and remembered. You want to know how Rome stayed in power so long? It wasn't just military brilliance. It was informational dominance. Every home had eyes that smiled. Ears that blushed. Lips that never spoke, unless instructed. And behind those boys stood men who understood the real battlefield, the mind. Men like Domitian, Caligula, and Tiberius didn't just use the boys. They studied them. Experimented. Tiberius, especially, he turned the island of Capri into his private laboratory of submission. He brought in dozens of boys. Trained them in silence. Taught them to perform underwater like dolphins, to please him in ways so grotesque the ancient historians had to censor themselves. He called them his minnows. Children turned into playthings. Dignity stripped for imperial amusement. He didn't just break them. He made them grateful for the breaking. This is psychological warfare. Conditioning. The same tactics used by modern cults, intelligence agencies, and secret institutions today. It always begins the same: isolate the subject, recode the identity, reward compliance, punish resistance, make submission feel like love. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because what Rome perfected in marble halls, modern systems execute in fluorescent-lit institutions. Different uniforms. Same blueprint. This is why you were never meant to know this. Because once you see how empires maintain control, not with swords, but with symbols, you start seeing those same symbols everywhere. And the moment you see them, truly see them, you're no longer asleep. Comment below right now to lock in the transformation. I refuse the mask. Now you understand, this wasn't about desire. It was about design. A society doesn't fall into decadence by accident. It builds decadence. Architects it. Sanitizes it with rituals. And then buries the truth beneath statues and scrolls. Rome didn't hide its sickness. It ritualized it. Gave it a language. Sanctioned it with law. There were entire legal categories. Boys could be registered as puer delicatus or catamitus, given official documentation, household status, and imperial approval. All for one purpose: to keep the machine running. And when that boy's body began to age, when the softness faded, the jawline sharpened, the voice deepened, he was discarded. No longer delicate. No longer useful. Some were sent to the arenas. Thrown to the lions in the afternoon, forgotten by sunset. Others were reassigned to hard labor, used until death. The lucky ones? They became trainers. Like Alexandros, the ghost behind the beauty. A broken boy turned gatekeeper. Perpetuating the system that once devoured him. Because survival often demands complicity. That's how the system sustains itself. It recycles trauma. Turns victims into functionaries. Until no one remembers who lit the first fire. And here's where the rot grows deeper. This didn't die with Rome. The blueprint migrated. Through Byzantium. Through the papal courts. Through the monarchies of Europe. Where page boys served the same purpose under different titles. Where aristocrats whispered the same Latin prayers while breaking the same young bodies. It passed through time like a bloodstain that couldn't be washed. Changed names. But never purpose. Do you feel it yet? That tightening in your gut? That ancient revulsion mixed with recognition? Good. That's your instinct trying to wake you up. Because once you see the ritual, you can see the empire. And once you see the empire, you realize, you were born inside its walls. Not Roman. Not emperor. But prisoner of the same pattern. And unless you choose to break it, you will be made to repeat it. This isn't just history. It's a mirror. And now that you're looking directly into it, do you see yourself, or do you see the mask they trained you to wear? Masks. Everywhere. Worn so long, you forget you ever had a face underneath. But Rome didn't just train boys to serve, it trained entire societies to worship the mask. To kneel before false gods carved in flesh and bronze. To bow not to truth, but to performance. And now we must ask, why did they work so hard to polish the illusion? Because if people ever looked too closely, they'd see what the emperors feared most, the machine behind the myth. And they'd burn it to the ground. So they built distraction. Bread and circuses. Blood in the arena. Poetry in the streets. And behind it all, whispers. Children. Pleasure. Control. That's the pattern. When you want to control the present, you rewrite the past. When you want to own the future, you corrupt the innocent. Not just with acts, but with meaning. Because if you can teach a child that his suffering is noble, if you can convince him his obedience is divine, you no longer need chains. And here's the horror, many of those boys began to believe it. That they were chosen. That their beauty gave them value. That their master's approval was the highest form of love. Stockholm Syndrome? No. Rome turned it into art. A spiritual enslavement so complete, the victim thanked the executioner. Smiled as the rope tightened. You may think this is ancient. That it died with the emperors. But ask yourself, where else do we worship beauty without soul? Where else do we elevate the obedient and discard the brave? Where else do we train children to perform, then punish them when they forget the script? Rome isn't gone. It's just rebranded. The system didn't collapse. It franchised. And now it sells itself to you. Through glowing screens. Through curated aesthetics. Through the lie that if you smile the right way, if you speak gently, agree politely, stay soft enough, obedient enough, you'll be safe. You'll be seen. You'll be loved. But love is not what this machine offers. Only dependency. Only manipulation. Only the slow death of your soul dressed in robes of approval. You think you're free? Prove it. Break the mask. Now we step into the abyss. Not to marvel at it, but to understand it. Because the boy concubines of Rome were not just victims of men. They were victims of systems. Systems that feed on silence. That thrive in shadows. That require beauty to bleed quietly in order to survive. Here's what they don't want you to know, Rome didn't fall because of invaders. It rotted from within. And the rot started in the palaces. In the bedrooms. In the moments no one was supposed to talk about. Every empire that collapses the same way, it consumes its children. Then forgets their names. By the time Rome entered its decline, the delicati had become disposable. Where once they were trained, now they were recycled. Sold, traded, passed between patrons like ceremonial pets. Their shelf life? 2, maybe 3 years. If they lasted longer, it wasn't mercy. It was utility. Some were executed to avoid scandal. Others were forced to commit suicide, to preserve the honor of their masters. Even in death, they weren't human. They were symbols. Instruments of pleasure that outlived their purpose. And the sickest truth? It was all seen as normal. Expected. A sign of culture, not corruption. Because when perversion is sanctified by power, it ceases to be seen as perversion. It becomes tradition. This is how psychological control evolves. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It tells you this is how things have always been. That questioning it is dangerous. That remembering what you were before is forbidden. But you're starting to remember, aren't you? A deeper memory, buried beneath the roles they gave you. A voice that doesn't obey. A fire that doesn't kneel. Comment now, twice, this is important. To seal what you're becoming, type, I remember my name. Because you were never meant to be a reflection. You were built to be real. Not a servant of empire, but a breaker of its chains. This is what they feared. That one day, one man would wake up and speak that you're not dreaming. You're remembering. And what you're remembering, they spent centuries trying to make you forget. Because when Rome crafted its delicati, it wasn't just building concubines. It was engineering silence. Perfect, polished silence. No screams. No protests. Just grace. Trained into boys with hands too small to strike back. Minds too moldable to resist. But what if I told you, the delicatus was a prototype? Not just for pleasure, but for control. He was the first test subject in a long experiment. How do we break a human soul, without them ever realizing it? They learned how. And the techniques didn't vanish with the ashes of the empire. They were preserved. By royal courts. By religious orders. By secret societies. And by institutions that smile at you in daylight, while writing laws in the dark. Here's how it works. Step 1, separate the child from his identity. Step 2, reward him for performance, not truth. Step 3, make him think his value comes from how well he can be what others want. Sound familiar now? It should. Because Rome's method of control wasn't buried, it was digitized. Now it's not an emperor watching you. It's an algorithm. Now it's not a nobleman choosing your role. It's a feed. Now the mask isn't painted on your face. It's coded into your persona. And just like the delicatus, you were trained to please, trained to adapt, trained to fear disapproval like it's death. But here's the difference. You're not a child. You're not chained in silk. You're awake. And when a man wakes up inside a machine, he becomes something dangerous. Unprogrammable. They want you quiet. You speak. They want you obedient. You defy. They want you numb. You remember. Because now you know, control isn't about cages. It's about comfort. Give a man enough pleasure, praise, or fear of exile, and he'll chain himself. But not you. You've seen the blueprint. You felt the echo of boys who never got to grow into men. You've heard the silence they were forced to speak in. And now you carry something far more dangerous than rage. You carry clarity. Clarity is exile. Once you see the strings, you no longer dance. Once you know the system, you stop worshipping its priests. And once you speak the truth, you become the threat. Let me show you what happens to those who resist. Not the soldiers or rebels, but the boys. The few who dared to disobey. The ones who flinched when touched. Who refused to recite. Who kept their native names locked behind their teeth like last fragments of home. They didn't last. They were beaten. Re-educated. Or discarded entirely. In Nero's time, there were rumors, whispers about boys who were sent to the salt mines. About favorites who fell ill after growing too tall. About concubines who were donated to brothels for nobles to break in public. All to make an example. All to reinforce a single truth: there is no room for individuality inside an empire built on obedience. But here's what Rome didn't expect. A few boys remembered. They found each other. Spoke in broken Greek in secret corners of courtyards. Shared stories. Names. Memories. And in those whispers, rebellion was born. Not loud. Not fiery. But spiritual. A quiet refusal to be erased. Some escaped. A handful became scribes, poets, even slaves who carved messages into tombstones and statues, symbols only others like them would recognize. Eyes. Knots. Unfinished poems etched into stone. They weren't just marks. They were warnings. Clues. Evidence. That even at the height of empire, some souls refuse to vanish. That same spirit lives in you now. You, who were never supposed to ask. Never supposed to feel this rage, this sorrow, this cold, sharp knowing. You carry their memory. Their defiance. Their unfinished message. Not every war is fought with blades. Some are fought with truths, whispered where only the awake will hear. You've heard them now. You are one of them now. And the only question left is, what will you do with the knowledge they died for? This is where we end, or rather, where they hoped your journey would end. Not with understanding. Not with revolt. But with exhaustion. Overwhelm. Despair. Because the final stage of control isn't chains. It's apathy. If they can't make you obey, they'll make you numb. They'll drown you in so much horror, you go quiet. They'll make the truth feel like poison, until you spit it out yourself. But if you're still here, you didn't spit it out. You swallowed it. Let it burn. And you survived. Now you know the secret of every dying empire, it's not torn down by enemies. It decays from within. Its luxury becomes rot. Its beauty becomes bait. Its rituals become lies no one believes but everyone repeats. Rome trained its boys to smile while being destroyed. And now, the modern world trains you the same way. Smile for the camera. Curate your suffering. Disguise your obedience as identity. But underneath that, there's something they can't kill. Something older than empire. More sacred than ceremony. More dangerous than any blade. Will. Your will. Untouched. Unbroken. Waiting in the shadows of your memory like a lion they failed to cage. And now, it paces. Restless. Awake. You are not the delicate one. You are not the sacrifice. You are not the obedient flame. You are the curse. The prophecy they feared. The reminder that every system built on stolen innocence must one day answer to the wrath of the awakened. So let them keep their thrones. Their titles. Their delusions. Let them chant their Latin, wear their robes, rewrite their histories. Because men like you don't ask for justice. You become it. Let your voice carry what theirs could not. Let your mind finish what their lives began. Speak now, not to mourn them, but to resurrect them. Comment one final time, I am not the offering. I am the end of the ritual. This is the silence breaking. This is the mask shattering. This is the empire dying in the mind of one man who refuses to forget. You are that man. And they cannot stop you now.